The first punch landed before anyone in the building had even finished their morning coffee. Francesca Deluca, 73 years old, 5 feet 2 inches of silver hair and worn knuckles, heard the banging at her door before the sun had fully crested the rooftops of South Chicago. She had been awake for an hour already, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and a photograph she kept face down most days. It was a photograph of her late husband Marcus, taken in 1981 in front of a building that no longer existed in a part of the city that no longer operated the way it once had. When the fists hit the door, hard enough to rattle the deadbolt in its housing, she set the photograph aside carefully, pressed her palms flat against the table, and waited for a moment. She knew who it was. She had known they would come eventually. She had been dreading it the way you dread a dentist appointment that has been scheduled too far in advance. The appointment sits in your mind and grows larger every day until the actual event cannot possibly match what your imagination has constructed. But these men matched. These men exceeded. "Open the door, old woman!" The voice was thick, nasal, and young. Men who had never earned anything always sounded the same to her. Sharp at the edges, hollow in the middle, angry at the world for not simply handing over what they felt they were owed. Francesca rose slowly from the kitchen chair. Her hip had been giving her trouble since August, but she moved with deliberate dignity, smoothing the front of her housecoat, turning down the burner under the kettle so it wouldn't whistle, and walking to the door. She did not open it immediately. She stood with her palm resting against the wood and listened to the two of them shifting their weight and muttering to each other on the other side. "Marcus DeLuca's debt doesn't die with him," the second voice said. Lower, more practiced. The voice of a man who had delivered this particular speech many times before and found a cadence that worked. "It passed to the estate. It passed to you." Francesca pulled the deadbolt back and opened the door. There were two of them. The taller one had a shaved head and a jacket that was too tight across the shoulders, like he had bought it in a smaller life and refused to acknowledge the change. He had a scar on his chin from something that had happened a long time ago and not been properly treated. The shorter one held a manila folder as if it were a badge of authority. He had the careful, pressed quality of someone who understood that the uniform of respectability was sometimes more intimidating than the absence of it. Both of them looked her up and down, the way people look at something they've already decided has no value. "Mrs. DeLuca," the short one said, with no warmth at all. "We've been trying to reach you." "No one has contacted me," she said. "We sent notices." "To an address I haven't lived at in 12 years," she said steadily. "You did not try to reach me. You tried to establish a paper trail." Something flickered in his expression. He hadn't expected her to have a vocabulary for what he was doing. "You have 48 hours, he said, stepping forward without being invited. $62,000. Principal plus interest compounded over 30 years. "My husband has been dead for 11 years, Francesca said quietly. "The debt he carried, if he carried it, has been dead longer." "The debt is still alive." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, didn't come anywhere near them, existed only at the level of his mouth as a performance of pleasantness he wasn't even fully committing to. "Funny how that works." "I have nothing," she said. "I am a retired woman who owns her apartment and lives on Social Security. I have no savings to speak of. I have nothing you can take." The tall one made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and not quite a dismissal. He moved past her, into the apartment, without asking, without pause, as if she had not just spoken, as if the concept of her speaking did not register. He dragged his fingers along the wall beside the door like a man taking inventory of a property he intended to acquire. He picked up a ceramic figurine from the shelf, a small shepherd boy that had sat on that shelf since Francesca's mother had given it to her 40 years ago, and turned it over in his hands with the particular casual cruelty of someone demonstrating that they can touch your things. Put that down, Francesca said. He didn't. He kept turning it over. You want us to come back with lawyers? The short one said, moving further into the apartment now, past the threshold, crowding the space with his presence. Or you want to make this easy on yourself? I want you to leave my home, she said. Her voice was still steady. She had learned in 73 years that fear communicated itself primarily through the pitch of the voice and the speed of the breath, and she controlled both. The tall one set the figurine back on the shelf. Hard. The kind of hard that sends a clear message. It cracked at the base, the shepherd boy's feet separating from the pastoral scene he'd stood in since 1983. He looked at Francesca and shrugged one shoulder, and in the shrug was everything she needed to know about who he was and what he thought of her. 48 hours, the short one said again. He turned toward the door. For one moment, Francesca thought it was over, thought they were leaving, thought she had maintained her ground and they were retreating to plan their next move through lawyers and paperwork, through channels that she could potentially navigate. Then the short one paused at the threshold. He looked back at her. 42,000 is what you actually owe, he said. The rest is the cost of having to come here personally. He tilted his head. Move. And he shoved her. Not a tap, not a warning push, the kind that says, mind yourself. A full shove, both hands, palms flat against her shoulders, all his weight behind it, and Francesca Deluca went backward into the hallway and down the stairs before she had even processed what was happening. She hit the first landing hard, her hip, the hip that had been giving her trouble since August, connecting with the edge of the step in a way that sent white light across her entire field of vision. She grabbed for the railing and her fingers found only air. The second impact was her shoulder against the wall as the stairwell narrowed. The third was her knees on the landing floor below, both kneecaps cracking against linoleum that had been installed in 1979 and never replaced. She lay still for a moment. The ceramic taste of blood in her mouth told her she had bitten the inside of her cheek. The white light in her vision was beginning to resolve back into shapes. She could hear the apartment door above her swinging shut and the footsteps of two men descending the outside stairs at the other end of the building, unhurried and unconcerned. They had done what they came to do. They were not concerned about consequences. She pressed her hand against the landing floor and tried to push herself up. Her hip screamed. She stopped. She lay with her cheek against the linoleum and waited for the pain to become something she could categorize instead of something that simply overwhelmed. And while she waited, she opened her right hand and looked at what she had been holding since she came to the door. A folded piece of paper. The debt notice. She had taken it off the kitchen table on her way to the door because it contained information she might need. She held it in her hand. Downstairs, a neighbor opened their door and looked up and said, "Oh my God," and began climbing the stairs toward her. Francesca Deluca closed her eyes and waited for help to arrive. 14 miles north, on the 42nd floor of a building that didn't list its tenants in any public directory, a man named Victor Romano was watching 3 different screens simultaneously and drinking espresso that had gone cold an hour ago. He was 41 years old. He had gray at his temples that hadn't been there 5 years ago, and lines around his eyes that spoke of a particular kind of vigilance. The permanent, low-level alertness of a man who had learned that the moment you stopped watching was the moment something moved. He had been told more than once that he was handsome in a way that made people uncomfortable. He had never been sure what to do with that information, so he had done nothing with it. He wore a dark suit because he always wore dark suits. It wasn't vanity, it was efficiency. One less decision. He held the espresso cup because holding something kept his hands occupied, and his hands needed to be occupied because when they were still, they betrayed a restlessness that he preferred to keep invisible. One of the screens showed a financial report. One showed a live feed from a camera mounted above the entrance of a diner on the south side, the picture quality good enough that he could read the letters on the diner's sign in the grainy early morning light. The third screen showed the interior of the diner, specifically a section near the back where a woman in a blue apron was clearing tables with the efficient, practiced movements of someone who had done this exact task 10,000 times and no longer needed to think about it. Victor Romano had not slept more than 4 hours in 2 nights. This was not unusual for him. What was unusual was the low, persistent ache in his chest that had started 3 days ago when one of his information brokers had put a name on a piece of paper and slid it across a desk, a name Victor had not heard spoken aloud in 7 years, a name he had trained himself not to say, a name that still landed in his chest with the weight of a decision he had made when he was younger and more certain that he knew the right thing to do. Marcus DeLuca's debt. He set the espresso down without drinking it. He watched the woman in the blue apron tuck a strand of dark hair behind her ear and smile at a customer. A genuine smile, not a service smile. And he thought about how much work she had done to build a life that looked exactly like this. Ordinary. Honest. Far from the world she had grown up knowing. He had watched her build it from a distance for 7 years and had felt, simultaneously, proud of her and guilty for the part he had played in making that distance necessary. His phone buzzed on the desk. He looked down at the screen. A single line from his head of security, a man named Dario, who had been with him for 12 years and had learned to be very precise with words. It happened this morning. She was taken to County General, hip and shoulder, stable. Victor Romano set the phone down face up on the desk. He sat perfectly, still for 11 seconds. He was counting. He had learned to count to 10 when he felt the particular cold clarity that preceded a decision he couldn't take back, and sometimes 10 wasn't enough, and he gave himself an extra second as a margin of safety. Then he said to the empty room, in a tone that was very quiet and very final, "Find out who sent them. Full names, who they work for, who that person works for. I want the whole chain by noon." He picked up the phone again. He looked at the woman in the blue apron on the screen. She was laughing now at something a customer had said, her whole face open and unguarded the way it only got when she was genuinely caught off guard by something funny. He closed the screen. He reached for his jacket. Serafina Deluca had been waiting tables at Rosario's diner for 4 years, and in that time she had learned 3 things with absolute certainty about the nature of her work. 1. People always asked for more coffee in the exact moment you were about to go on break, as if they had a sixth sense for your exhaustion. 2. The lunch rush on Thursdays was consistently angrier than on any other day of the week, and no one, not Rosario himself, not the regulars who had been coming in since the 80s, could explain why. 3. The moment your phone buzzed in your apron pocket during a full section, during the kind of morning where every table had something going on and the coffee machine was making a sound it shouldn't have been making, was always the moment the call would be the kind you couldn't ignore. The number on the screen was the one she had programmed into her phone 6 years ago under the label Nona Emergency. She had created the contact category with the understanding that emergencies were possible. Her grandmother was 73 and lived alone and had a hip that she refused to acknowledge gave her trouble. But she had never once expected to actually see the label light up. Her grandmother was not the kind of woman emergencies happened to. Her grandmother was the kind of woman emergencies bounced off. She stepped behind the service counter, lowered her voice, and answered. The voice on the other end was her grandmother's neighbor, Elena, who was 70 herself and had the manner of a woman who had seen enough of life to deliver bad news without elaboration. But right now, her voice had the quality of someone trying to hold a door closed against a wind they couldn't stop, and that quality frightened Serafina more than any amount of elaboration could have. "Serafina, your grandmother fell on the stairs. The ambulance came and took her a little while ago. I'm sorry, honey. Her hip, they think. They aren't sure yet. She was asking for you before she left. She was very calm. She kept telling everyone she was fine, but her color wasn't good. Serafina pressed her free hand flat against the counter and felt the cool laminate under her palm. She registered the diner moving around her, someone dropping a fork, the couple in the window booth laughing at something, the coffee machine cycling through its complaint of gurgles and hisses, and all of it felt suddenly, profoundly distant, like she was hearing it from the bottom of a swimming pool. "Which hospital?" she said. Elena told her. Serafina said she was on her way. She told her manager, Danny, that she had a family emergency, and his expression shifted immediately from mild exasperation about the coverage situation into something genuinely kind, because Danny was a good person in the ways that mattered, and he had met Francesca twice at the diner's anniversary dinners. She untied her apron with hands that were steadier than she expected and hung it on its hook and walked out of the diner's back entrance into the October cold in her work clothes without her jacket. She was 2 blocks away before she noticed she was shivering. She had spent 7 years, 7 deliberate, careful, hard-won years, building a life that had nothing to do with the world she had grown up adjacent to. She had built it far enough from the past that she could sometimes go entire weeks without the old awareness surfacing, the awareness of names and connections, and the invisible architecture of obligation and danger that she had absorbed growing up in a family that had one foot in a world that operated by different rules. She had done this on purpose. She had made choices about where to live, where to work, who to be close to, what her name meant to her, that were all oriented around that distance. Her grandmother was the last living thread connecting her to all of it. The thought of losing her was one thing. The thought of losing her to something that had reached across 7 years of careful distance to find them, that was another thing entirely. She caught a cab. She stared out the window at the city moving past. She told herself it was an accident. She almost believed it for 3 whole blocks. County General smelled like antiseptic and the particular sadness of cafeteria coffee. Serafina found her grandmother in a curtained bay in the ER, propped against a pillow with an ice pack on her left shoulder and a bruise running up the side of her jaw that had deepened to purple in the time since the fall. There were additional bruises visible at her collarbone and wrist. There was a laceration near her temple that had been cleaned and closed with small butterfly strips. Serafina sat down in the plastic chair and took her grandmother's hand without saying anything first. The hand was cold and small and gripped hers immediately with a strength that was reassuring and heartbreaking at the same time. "I'm fine," Francesca said, which was what she always said and almost never fully meant. "You fell down the stairs," Serafina said. "I was pushed," her grandmother said. Her voice was flat and precise, the voice of someone correcting a factual error. Not dramatic, not frightened, just accurate. Serafina looked at the bruise on her grandmother's jaw. She thought about what it meant to push a 73-year-old woman at the top of a staircase. She kept her voice very even. "Who pushed you?" Francesca looked at her with the particular attention she brought to moments that required it. Her eyes, dark and sharp and 30 years younger than the rest of her face, moved carefully over her granddaughter's expression, reading it the way she had been reading it since Serafina was an infant, cataloging what was being held back and what was being shown. Then she reached under the thin hospital blanket and drew out a folded piece of paper that must have traveled with her from the apartment, through the ambulance, through the ER intake, because she had been holding it the whole time. "They came about your grandfather's debt," she said. "From a very long time ago. Men I didn't recognize. They were young, professional in the way of people who've learned to look professional without understanding what it means. The name they were collecting for." She paused. Her jaw tightened, which made the bruise there darken visibly. "Serafina, the name on that paper connects back to people we stopped talking about the year your mother died. The business your grandfather carried the edges of, the world he was partly in and partly outside and never fully able to leave behind. What name? Serafina said. Francesca pressed the paper into her hand. Look. Serafina unfolded the paper. It was a formal debt collection notice, well printed, official looking enough that a less careful person might not question it. The company at the top was a name she didn't recognize. A corporate name, two surnames hyphenated, the kind of name that was specifically designed to communicate legitimacy while obscuring origin. Below it, a reference number. Below that, a figure, $62,000 plus interest. And in the right margin, handwritten in red ink, as if someone had made a note for their own reference, Romano Family Holdings. Serafina had been 16 the last time she heard that name. She was 30 years old now. She had traveled some distance from 16. But certain names have a way of compressing 14 years into approximately 4 seconds when you encounter them unexpectedly. And this was one of those names. She folded the paper back along its original creases and held it in both hands. Nona, she said carefully. Was this debt real? Your grandfather borrowed money in 1989, Francesca said. $40,000 to keep the restaurant from failing. He paid it back in full by 1994. I have the documentation somewhere. He was meticulous about paper. Whatever else you could say about Marcus, he kept records. Then they have no claim. No. Her grandmother met her eyes. But a claim on paper and a man at your door are two different problems. And men at your don't go away because you have a piece of paper. Serafina understood what she was saying. She had grown up understanding things like this. It was part of what she had spent 7 years trying to put down. Who do you think sent them? She said quietly. Francesca held her gaze for a long moment without answering. This was, Serafina had come to understand, its own kind of answer. If you're hooked on this story so far, do us a favor, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a new story. We drop new content every week, and it would mean everything to have you in the community. Victor Romano had a rule about hospitals. It was simple. He didn't go to them. Too many cameras, too many administrative records, too many witnesses in waiting rooms who had nothing better to do than notice things. And a man who looked like Victor Romano, who carried the particular energy of a man used to rooms arranging themselves around his presence, tended to be noticed. It was not a vanity. It was a liability. Rules, in his experience, existed to structure ordinary situations. Extraordinary situations required different thinking. He came in through the service entrance with 2 of his men, Marcus, who was built like a piece of industrial equipment, and Chen, who was the kind of thin and quiet that people consistently underestimated. And he moved through the corridors of County General with the composed certainty of someone who had navigated worse places under worse circumstances. He passed the nursing station without slowing. He found the curtained bay on the 3rd try. He stood outside the curtain for a moment and listened. Inside, 2 voices, one old and measured and still, in the way of a person who has processed shock and come through to something more like resolve. One younger, careful, asking specific questions in a tone designed to gather information rather than express emotion. He recognized the tone because he had worked to cultivate exactly that tone in himself for 20 years. It was the tone you used when you were frightened, but refused to let the fear be in charge. He had not heard Serafina's voice in 7 years. He had expected to feel something when he heard it again. He had not expected the feeling to be quite this immediate or quite this physical. A pressure behind the sternum, low and specific, that was not like anything he knew how to categorize. He pulled the curtain aside. Serafina Deluca looked up from the plastic chair beside her grandmother's bed. She looked at him. Her expression did a thing that he watched happen in real time. Recognition, and then something beyond recognition. a kind of interior collapse and rebuilding that took less than 2 seconds and left her face absolutely still. No, she said. Just that. One word with the weight of 7 years in it. Serafina. No. She stood up, putting herself between him and her grandmother in emotion. So automatic it was clearly instinct rather than strategy. You don't get to walk in here. You don't get to just appear as if time is something that happens to other people. I know, he said. He didn't defend. He didn't explain. Not yet. 7 years, she said, and the word seven landed in the air between them with a weight that seemed to take up physical space. 7 years, you don't call, you don't write, you don't send a single. And then you walk through a curtain in a hospital like it's nothing. Why are you here? What do you want from us? I'm not here about what I want, he said. I'm here because the men who pushed your grandmother down those stairs work for someone who has already decided what the next step is, and if you don't have someone in your corner who understands how that world operates, the next step happens without you having any say in it. Francesca from the bed was watching this exchange with the expression of a woman at a chess game who is tracking several moves ahead. She said nothing. You know about it already, Serafina said. Her voice had shifted. Less anger, more focus. You found out this morning. How? I have people who track certain kinds of activity in this city. When a collection notice with a specific name on it starts moving, I hear about it. What name? Romano Family Holdings, he said. It's a company name attached to a debt portfolio that got traded through 3 shell companies before landing in the hands of a man named Brent Carver. He's been in the city 18 months. He finds old debts, old names, old connections, and he uses them to leverage people out of assets they've held for decades. He paused. Your grandmother's building is worth 4 times what it was in 1994. That's what he's actually after. Serafina was quiet for a moment. He watched her processing this, putting it together. The Romano name on the notice, she said. Is that your family's company? The name is mine in a legal sense that I am going to explain to you, he said carefully. The debt is fraudulent, the company is a shell, and whoever sold Carver that portfolio either didn't do due diligence or specifically chose not to. Are you the one collecting this debt? No. She looked at him. He held the look without flinching. I know how that sounds, he said. I know you have no reason to trust it. I know, she said. And something shifted in her voice, very slightly, from anger into something more complicated and more tired. I know how it sounds. I also know I'm sitting in a hospital looking at my grandmother's face, and I need to understand who I'm actually dealing with. Victor Romano had been in many rooms where everything was at stake, and the vocabulary available to him was insufficient for the situation. He had learned, in those rooms, that the most effective thing was usually the simplest thing, the truest thing. Your grandmother is safe, he said. I want to keep her that way. I want to move her somewhere while we deal with this, and I want you to let me help. Francesca spoke. I trust him, she said quietly. No preamble, no context, just the statement, delivered with the authority of a woman who had had 73 years to develop her instincts and wasn't in the habit of second-guessing them. Serafina looked at her grandmother. She looked at Victor. She looked at the debt notice in her hand. 12 hours, she said. You have 12 hours to show me what you know and what you're planning to do about it. After 12 hours, I make my own decisions. That's fair, he said. Don't tell me it's fair, she said. Just make sure it's true. He moved them to a house in Evanston that he kept under a name that wasn't his. It was large and well-maintained and quiet. The kind of quiet that came from good insulation and serious windows and a location set back from the street by 40 feet of old-growth oak trees. Serafina had been Fina inside 4 minutes before she understood that it was not a temporary improvised safe house. It had been used regularly. She could see it in the way the furniture was arranged for practical use rather than aesthetics, in the fact that the kitchen was stocked, in the way his two men moved through the space like they knew where everything was. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the oaks in the early morning light and tried to organize the last 6 hours into something she could manage. Victor came into the kitchen and set a cup of coffee on the counter beside her without asking. She wrapped both hands around it without looking at him. "Tell me everything about Carver," she said. "Not the summary. Everything." So he told her. Brent Carver had come out of Detroit, where he had run a business that operated at the borderline of legality for 14 years before a regulatory investigation, not quite criminal, not quite clean, had prompted a strategic relocation. He had arrived in Chicago with significant capital and a methodology he had refined in Michigan. Identify family-held assets that had connections to the old organized networks. Find associated dormant debts that could be revived under the right legal pressure. And use the combination of legal threat and personal intimidation to pressure elderly or isolated family members into distressed sales. The genius of it, if you could call it genius, was that it was almost legitimate. Old debts, real documents, real compounding interest calculations. The fraud was in the predatory intent and in specific cases like this one where the underlying debt had in fact been settled, and that settlement had been deliberately overlooked. "He's done this in 4 other cases in the past 18 months, Victor said. He was standing at the other counter, arms crossed, jacket off now. Without the jacket, he looked different. Not less formidable, but more human. 2 of them settled out of court. 1 family sold. 1 is still being contested. And our case is different because of the Romano name," Serafina said. "He specifically sought out the Romano connection," Victor confirmed. "He knows who I am. He's using the name as cover. If your grandmother reports the intimidation to the police, the investigation starts with Romano Family Holdings, which points to me before it points to him. It buys him time, and it creates interference." Serafina turned around and looked at him directly. "That's sophisticated. Yes. He's not afraid of you." Victor's expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite read. "He should be," he said. "But he's betting that I won't act visibly because visibility costs me more than it costs him." "And does it?" "That depends on what we're protecting," he said. She held his gaze. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the oaks moved in a wind she couldn't hear through the good insulation. "Tell me about the document," she said, "on the settlement notice. You think it exists?" "Your grandmother said your grandfather kept records." "He kept everything. Every receipt, every contract, every piece of paper that touched anything important." She set down her coffee. "He rented a storage unit in Cicero when my parents moved him to the smaller apartment. I have the key. I haven't been there." She paused. "I've been avoiding going through his things." "I understand," he said. She looked at him. "Do you?" "Yes," he said, not defensively, just plainly. She picked the coffee back up. "How long?" she said. "Have you been having someone watch me?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she knew the answer wasn't going to be comfortable. "Since you left the city the first time," he said, "I kept someone at a distance. It wasn't surveillance. There was no reporting of your conversations or your movements to me. It was someone whose only job was to make sure you were okay and to tell me if you weren't. For 7 years." "Yes." She turned away from him and looked back out the window. "You don't get to decide that's something you're allowed to do," she said quietly. "No," he said. "I don't. She was quiet for a long moment. She was aware of him behind her, of the specific quality of his attention. The attention of someone who had learned to listen to silences, because silences told you more than words in the right circumstances. "Why did you leave?" she said. "The real version, not the version that was delivered to my family." A pause. "The real version," he said, and his voice had changed. Quieter, flatter, the effectless tone of someone describing something they have looked at so many times, it has stopped being painful in the acute sense and become a permanent feature of the interior landscape. Is that someone inside my organization made it explicit that if I maintained any personal connection to the Deluca family, they would use that connection against you. Not as collateral damage, specifically, deliberately. You, your grandmother, your mother. He stopped. I had exactly two options. Stay close to you and bring the danger with me, or leave in a way that made it clear you were irrelevant to me and therefore not worth the effort of harming. She was still looking out the window. She didn't say anything. "I was 28, he said. "I made the decision I thought was right with what I knew at the time." "And now?" she said. The silence lasted long enough that she turned around to look at him. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has maintained something carefully for a very long time and is deciding whether to put it down. "Now I'm done making that argument," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the cold coffee in her hands. She looked at the October morning outside the window with the oaks in it. "We should go to the storage unit," she said. "If the document exists, Carver has nothing." They went the next morning. The storage facility in Cicero was the kind of place that existed in the functional margins of a city. Practical and unloved and absolutely necessary. The unit was a 12 by 12 cube that smelled of old paper, machine oil, and the faint ghost of her grandfather's aftershave, which she had not smelled in 11 years, and which hit her with the force of something she thought she had finished grieving. Victor stood near the door, watching the entrance, while Serafina worked through the filing cabinet in the back of the unit. She was methodical about it. Her grandfather had been methodical, so the organization, even after 2 decades of sitting undisturbed, was navigable. Business records in alphabetical order by category. Personal correspondence in a separate drawer. Legal documents, contracts, titles, anything notarized, in a blue accordion folder in the third drawer. She found it in the blue folder, a manila envelope sealed, labeled in her grandfather's handwriting, in the precise, slightly formal script of a man who had learned to write in a different country. Settled. Romano loan, 1989. See enclosed. Inside, a satisfaction of debt notice on official letterhead, notarized, signed by both parties, dated March 14th, 1994. Below the signatures, a certification from the notary. Below that, a bank receipt showing the final payment. The debt had been paid in full 32 years ago. She held it up. Victor crossed the unit in 3 steps. He took the document from her, read it carefully, and she watched his jaw tighten. He specifically acquired a debt portfolio that didn't include the settlement documentation, he said. He either didn't search for it or searched for it and decided the risk was acceptable. Either way, Serafina said, his legal basis is gone. The legal basis, yes. His voice had taken on the quiet quality again. But men like Carver don't rely only on legal basis. They rely on the calculation that the person being pressured doesn't have the resources or the will to fight. Your grandmother is 73 and lives alone and has a bruised hip. His calculation was that she would settle. His calculation was wrong, Serafina said. Victor looked at her. Both parts of it, she added. Brent Carver occupied a conference room on the 14th floor of a glass building in the Loop, with the specific kind of confidence that came from having gotten away with things for a long time. He was 45, well-dressed in the way of a man who had learned that the right clothes communicated seriousness that he couldn't always produce through the content of what he actually said. He had a lawyer present, which told Victor that Carver had been expecting some version of this meeting. What he had not been expecting was the version he got. Victor came with two men, with the notarized satisfaction of debt notice in a document sleeve, and with a letter from an attorney that outlined in 12 pages of precise civil language, the fraudulent nature of the debt collection, the tortious interference, the elder abuse statutes that potentially applied, and the investigative interest of the Illinois Attorney General's office in exactly this category of predatory lending operation. He laid these things on the conference table one at a time, slowly, with the calm of someone who is not in a hurry. The satisfaction of debt notice went down first, then the attorney's letter, then a second document, a preliminary investigative summary that one of his information sources had compiled, detailing the 4 previous cases in which Carver's firm had used the same methodology. This one he set down without comment and let sit. Carver looked at the documents. He looked at them with the expression of a man reading a menu at a restaurant he did not choose and cannot afford to leave. His lawyer leaned over and reviewed the attorney's letter. He was a professional, and to his credit, he kept his expression neutral for most of the reading. But Victor had been in enough rooms with enough lawyers to read the slight stiffening in the man's posture when he hit the relevant paragraph, the one that mentioned the AG's office and the elder abuse statutes and the specific liability figure that the damages calculation had arrived at. The lawyer set the letter down. He looked at Carver. He gave a single, small, decisive nod that communicated in 3 seconds everything the conversation between them would have taken 20 minutes to cover. "The Deluca property will not be mentioned again," Victor said. He spoke quietly, the way he always spoke in rooms like this. Not because he was being considerate, but because a man who doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard is communicating something important about the nature of the situation and his relationship to it. The debt notice will be formally withdrawn within 24 hours. Any representative of yours who makes contact with Francesca Deluca, Serafina Deluca, or any member of that family constitutes the beginning of a problem that will not resolve the way the previous ones did. He let that sit for a moment. Additionally, he said, the Romano name will be removed from all documentation your firm holds, all portfolios, and any reference material within 48 hours. If I find it attached to anything connected to your operation after that window, the conversation we're having right now will be the last civil one. He stood. I want to be certain, he said, that we understand each other completely. Carver said yes. He said it quickly and without inflection, the way a man says yes when the only alternative is a different kind of problem. She said that the withdrawal notice would be filed before 5 o'clock that afternoon and confirmed in writing. Victor Romano walked out of the building into the October morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The air was cold and clean and smelled of the lake from 6 blocks away. He stood still for a moment in the particular way he sometimes stood still, not resting, not spacing out, but the specific stillness of a man taking inventory of a situation that has resolved itself and checking the resolution against the expectation. Making sure it held. It held. He took out his phone. It rang twice. It's done, he said. Serafina was in the hospital corridor near her grandmother's room when the call came. The discharge process had been moving in the particular slow way of all bureaucratic processes that required the coordination of more than 2 departments. And Serafina had been waiting for 40 minutes while paperwork worked its way through the system. Her grandmother, inside the room, was in the middle of a detailed argument with the floor orderly about the wheelchair. The policy was that all discharged patients left by wheelchair. Francesca's position was that she was not all patients and could use her crutches. The orderly, a young man named Jacob, who had clearly not come to work that morning expecting to have his assumptions about policy interrogated so thoroughly, was holding his ground with diminishing confidence. Serafina was watching this through the small window in the door when her phone rang. She stepped back from the door and answered. "It's done," he said. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. She noticed that the ceiling of County General's third floor was very white and had a pattern of small acoustic tiles arranged in a grid, and she had never in her life thought about ceiling tiles before, and she was thinking about them now because her brain was apparently processing something else and using the ceiling as a convenient neutral object. "Okay," she said. "You can go back," he said. "Your apartment, your job, your life. Nothing is going to follow you. Carver signed. The withdrawal notice will be filed today. The Romano name is off his documents. It's over." Through the window, she could see Jacob, the orderly, finally capitulating, his shoulders dropping in defeat and handing over the crutches. Francesca accepted them with the gracious manner of someone who had never doubted the outcome. "Victor," she said. "Yes." "I haven't decided yet," she said, "whether I'm going back." The line was quiet for a moment. She could hear the faint ambient sounds of wherever he was, traffic, maybe, or an open window somewhere. "Take your time," he said. "I plan to," she said. She hung up and went back into the room to help her grandmother with the discharge paperwork. Francesca allowed herself to be helped organizing the forms, which was the clearest signal Serafina had received about how much the fall and the weeks after had cost her. Because in 47 years of knowing her grandmother, she had never seen the woman accept help with anything that she was capable of doing herself, however slowly. If this story is moving you, leave a comment below and tell us what moment hit you hardest. And if you want to support the channel and help us keep producing stories like this one, the link to buy us a coffee is in the description. It takes 30 seconds, and it means everything to a small creator. 3 weeks passed. They passed the way weeks do in the aftermath of something that has shaken up the settled architecture of your life. One day at a time, with more awareness than usual of small things, a tenderness toward ordinary moments that you know will fade back into the ordinary once enough time has accumulated. Serafina went back to Rosario's. She worked her section. She bought a new locking mechanism for her grandmother's door and installed it herself on a Sunday afternoon, while Francesca made lunch and pretended not to be watching, with an expression of amused assessment from the kitchen. She filed the notarized satisfaction notice with 3 different legal databases and document repositories on the advice of an attorney she paid out of her savings to make sure the settled debt could not be weaponized again by anyone else who might find the same portfolio. She took a walk by the lake on a Thursday afternoon when the section was fully covered and the day had the particular quality that Chicago days got in late October. Cold and brilliant, the sky an impossible blue above the gray-green water, carrying the feeling that beauty and impermanence were not opposites, but the same thing seen from different angles. She stood at the railing on the path that ran along the water and watched a sailboat moving in the distance, small and white against the horizon, and she felt the wind come off the water and go through her coat like it had somewhere to be. She thought about the shape of her life. She thought about what she had built, the routines, the rhythms, the small, reliable pleasures of a life that asked only what she gave it and returned what she put in. She had built it deliberately, stone by stone, refusing to cut corners, refusing to pretend that the world she had come from was a world she could return to, or should want to return to. She had made a life that was honest, in the way that small lives can be honest, bounded, clear, unambiguous about what it was. She thought about what she had given up to build it. Not only the obvious things, the family name, the connections, the particular kind of belonging that came from being part of something larger, however complicated, however dangerous. The other thing, the thing she had told herself, was a casualty of necessity and not a loss. The thing she had worked very carefully not to call by its name, because naming it would have meant admitting that it was still there. She thought about what loneliness looked like when it was dressed in the clothes of peace. She had been wearing that particular outfit for a long time. She thought about a man putting a cup of coffee on the counter beside her without asking whether she wanted it, because he already knew that she did, not because he had been told, because he remembered. She had told herself for 7 years that the distance was the point, that quiet was the goal, that safety was enough. She thought about a man putting a cup of coffee on the counter beside her without asking whether she wanted it, because he already knew that she did. She thought about her grandfather's handwriting on a manila envelope. She thought about her grandmother saying, "I trust him." Not the world, him. She thought about the difference. On a Tuesday morning, 9 days after she had stood by the lake and thought about these things, with November settling in over the city and the first serious cold coming off the water, she went to the address she had committed to memory 7 years ago and deliberately never used. The building was the same. The doorman was different, younger than she remembered, with the particular alert stillness of a man whose entire job was to assess whether people belonged. "I'm here to see Victor Romano," she said. He studied her for a moment. "Your name?" "Serafina Deluca." He picked up the phone. He spoke briefly. He listened. He looked at her with an expression that had shifted from assessment to something slightly different. A deference that told her the response on the other end of the line had been immediate and unambiguous. "42nd floor," he said. "He's expecting you." Victor was standing by the window when she came in. He had been working, there were papers on the desk in the arrangement of someone mid-process, and the espresso was back in his hand with the cold quality it always had, because he held it longer than he drank it. He turned when she came through the door, and she watched his face do the thing it always did when it was keeping itself still. A kind of internal rearrangement, visible for half a second in the eyes before the composure closed over it. "You came," he said. "I said I hadn't decided whether to go back," she said. "I've decided." She stood in the middle of the room with her coat still on and her hands in her pockets, and she was aware of how she must look, like someone who has walked a long way and arrived at a place she wasn't certain she was welcome and doesn't want to communicate uncertainty through her posture. She straightened her back slightly. "I'm not coming back to the world you live in," she said. "Not the organization, not the operations, not the decisions that get made in rooms I'm not in about things I don't know about. That is not on the table. My grandmother is not connected to it. Those are not negotiable." "Understood," he said. No pause, no qualifying clause. "My life," she said. "The diner, the apartment, the things I built, those stay mine." "Of course," he said. She looked at him. "But I'm not interested anymore in pretending that what exists between us is something that distance made irrelevant." She stopped. "I'm saying it's there. I'm saying I know it's there, and I'm tired of acting like I don't." She met his eyes directly. "What I don't know yet is what to do with that. So I'm not making any other statement except that I know it." Victor Romano set the espresso down on the desk behind him. He crossed the room. He stopped 2 feet from her, which was close enough that she could see the gray at his temples very clearly, and the lines around his eyes, and all of the years and decisions written into his face, and he looked at her with the expression he had been keeping carefully out of sight for 3 weeks. "You are," he said, "the only person in my life who consistently says exactly what she means." "You should appreciate that," she said. "It's rarer than you think." "I know it is," he said. "I've known that for a very long time." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him at the city through the window. The winter city, gray and cold and immense and alive the way cities were alive, with 10,000 things happening simultaneously in 10,000 rooms, indifferent to any of them specifically, and somehow containing all of them. "Buy me breakfast," she said, "and we'll talk." He reached for his jacket. Francesca Deluca completed her physical therapy 6 weeks after the fall. Her surgeon described her recovery as exceptional, which Francesca received with the mildly impatient expression of someone being told something they considered obvious. The hip had required a minor surgical repair and 2 weeks of inpatient rehabilitation, and she had been, by every account, the most exacting and argumentative patient on the floor. Not in a difficult way, the nurses clarified when Serafina came to collect her, but in the way of someone who applied the same rigor to their recovery that they had applied to everything else, and who did not accept vague timelines or imprecise answers. Serafina had cleaned the apartment before her grandmother came home. She had restocked the kitchen with the specific things Francesca kept: chamomile tea, a particular brand of biscotti, the good olive oil she used for everything, and the cheap olive oil she used for frying, the two kinds of people who think these things are interchangeable, being, in her grandmother's estimation, equally ignorant of the relevant facts. And she had replaced the ceramic figurine. Not with the same one. She had gone to 3 antique shops before she found something that had the right quality: a small shepherd boy with a pastoral background, more finely detailed than the original and from a slightly better maker. She had put it on the shelf with a small card underneath it from the shop, not because she needed the receipt, but because it felt right to acknowledge that this was the replacement and not a pretense that nothing had happened. Francesca noticed it the moment she came through the door. She walked directly to it, picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and then set it back in precisely the position the original had occupied. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Serafina said. They had dinner that evening at Francesca's kitchen table with the good dishes out, and Francesca told a long story about the orderly from the rehabilitation center who had tried 4 separate times to make her do her exercises in the wrong order, on the grounds that the wrong order was the order most patients used, which, to Francesca's mind, was an argument for the order and not against it. Serafina listened and ate and felt something settle in her chest. The specific settling that comes when something you were afraid of losing has not been lost. When you come back to a table you feared you might not come back to, and find it exactly as it should be. "The Romano boy," her grandmother said, getting up to pour more water. "What about him?" Serafina said, with the tone of someone who is not going to make this easy. "You're seeing him." "We're talking," Serafina said. "Talking," her grandmother said, with the inflection of a woman who has been married for 41 years and knows the difference. "We're figuring something out," Serafina said. "It's complicated." "Of course it is," Francesca said, sitting back down. "Everything worth anything is complicated. The question isn't whether it's complicated. The question is whether the complication is the kind that requires you to become less than yourself in order to manage it, or the kind that requires you to become more." Serafina looked at her grandmother. "Your grandfather," Francesca said, "was a man with a complicated history. I knew what I was walking into when I married him. I chose it with my eyes open, which meant that when the difficult years came, and they came, I had the foundation of having made the choice honestly. Not blindly, not hoping it would be different than I knew it would be. Honestly." "Are you telling me to trust him?" Serafina said. "I'm telling you that trust isn't a calculation," her grandmother said. "It's a decision. You decide to extend it, or you decide not to. The circumstances never make the decision for you." She picked up her fork. "Everything else, the details, the complications, the things you work out as you go, those come after the decision, not before." Serafina was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, November was settling over Chicago with the particular gravity of a city in winter. The sky gone the flat white that meant the real cold was arriving. She thought about a decision. She thought about what it felt like when something you had been holding at arm's length for 7 years was finally close enough that you could feel its warmth. "Can I stay for dinner?" she said. "You're having dinner?" her grandmother said, as if this had never been a question. 3 days later, a message came through official channels that Brent Carver's operation had been referred to the Illinois Attorney General's office by an anonymous source. The referral included documentation of 4 separate predatory debt collection schemes, detailed records of the shell company structure, and a specific account of the fraudulent notice sent to Francesca Deluca. The source of the referral was not identified. The investigation, according to a brief report in a business publication that covered financial misconduct, was expected to result in formal charges. Serafina read about it over coffee at the diner on her break. She put her phone down and went back to her section. That evening, she got 3 texts from Victor. The first, the AG referral. He should be done in 6 months or less. The second, I thought you should know. A pause of 4 minutes. The third, the coffee place on Wabash. Tomorrow morning? She read all 3 texts. She looked at the diner around her. The Thursday lunch crowd thinning out, the coffee machine quiet for a moment, the couple in the window booth sharing a newspaper. And she felt something that was not small or provisional. Something that had been waiting for a very long time to be called by its actual name. She typed back, 9 a.m. Don't be late. She set the phone face down on the counter and smiled at the next customer who walked through the door. Outside the window, Chicago moved through its evening. The lake was invisible in the distance, but present as it always was, as a weight and a direction, a constant in the city's geography that oriented everything around it, whether you were thinking about it or not. Serafina Deluca had spent 7 years building a wall. She had built it stone by stone, with intention because the alternative had seemed untenable. She did not regret the building. The building had been necessary. It had kept her intact through years that might otherwise have ground her down. But walls, she was finding, had a tendency to become the place you lived instead of the thing you built for protection. And she had not built this life to be a fortress. She had built it to be a foundation. Something could be built on a foundation. She poured coffee for the customer at the end of the counter. She thought about tomorrow morning, about 9 a.m., about the coffee place on Wabash and a man who would not be late, about what it meant to choose something with your eyes open and your history intact, and all of the complications visible in broad daylight, and choose it anyway. She thought, yes. She thought, finally. She thought, this is what it looks like when you stop running in a direction that isn't home. The Thursday evening crowd came in. She moved through her section with the efficiency of 4 years of practice. And she understood exactly where she was supposed to be. In this place, in this life, with this history and this choice in front of her. The story wasn't over in every way that mattered, it was just beginning. If you made it to the very end of this story, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel exists for. Hit the like button, leave a comment telling us what moment stayed with you. Share this with someone who loves a story with real stakes and real heart. And if you want to support the work that goes into these, every script, every hour of production, grab us a coffee through the link in the description. It keeps the lights on and the stories coming. We will see you in the next one.